what would you say about government, folks in government, and particularly people at city government, which is a lot of what we're talking about? Do you see, what's your analysis essentially of the receptivity to change, and what is the kind of sense of what advice you might give in terms of, particularly around the sharing economy, but in general, this whole transition?
Well, the first thing I would say is when we're thinking about regulation and public policy, the first thing to think about should be, what are the legitimate social goals of any regulation? You know, what are you trying to do? And let's be really transparent about that. You know, for example, I recently landed at Newark Airport, took a lift into New York City. And I asked the driver, I said, so do you pick, when you do this, do you pick up in New York? He said, oh no, I can't do that, I have to go back to New Jersey. Now you go, what, you know, and this is this, you know, they've effectively recreated some of the same territoriality that they have, that they had for taxi companies, which is basically, you go, well, what's the public policy goal there? It's protectionism, you know, and, you know, that should be super clear. Let's lay out there and say, okay, we as a city have decided that we want to protect our industry. Okay, does everybody agree that this is the best public policy, you know, outcome? You know, what are some of the other alternatives? And so, you know, for example, you would look at, say, well, we want to reduce congestion. We want to, you know, protect consumers. You know, we want to get the best prices for consumers. We want to have the drivers, you know, we want to improve their income. You know, and if you think about that particular example, none of those other objectives, which are far more legitimate, are being met.
Right.
And you know, so that's the first thing. You know, be clear about what your objectives are. And there's actually a really wonderful new tool that I've been investigating called Polis, P-O-L.is. Basically it's a public policy debate tool put together by a guy named Colin McGill. And they did actually in Taiwan, they ran a process where you know, everybody from, you know, the cities through Uber all kind of participated in a public debate about what the legitimate goals of public policy were, and they came to a set of solutions that I think everybody was quite happy with. So I think that there's some new tools for having sort of open, informed debates about public policy. But so I think on the one hand, you have the cities who have to be really clear about what are they trying to accomplish. And also we need to realize that not one size doesn't fit all. You know, there may be some cities, for example, where they say, okay, you know, we could use a lot more housing, you know, in certain neighborhoods for you know, people coming in, because it will improve our tourist industry. You know, it's a great example for Airbnb. You know, and I think when I think about the benefits of Airbnb, you know, I don't just want to stay in a hotel. I may want to stay in a different part of the city, or I may, you know, like, you know, I go, you know, up to the Yuba River, and I can stay in an Airbnb in Nevada City. You know, there's a cheap motel, you know, a couple of old school B&Bs, but Airbnb gives these wide range of wonderful new opportunities. So your city like that, you go, yeah, we want some more Airbnb because it'll bring more people in. Clear public policy objective, you know, you want to support this. You know, there's other places where you go, well, we don't have enough housing for you know, our residents. People are being gentrified out, and you know, people buying second homes, you know, and turning them over for Airbnb rentals is actually contrary to that public policy objective. And so, you know, if you're clear about what the objectives are, then I think you can have a much more informed discussion. But then the second piece is, how do we use data on both sides more effectively? Some years back, I wrote a piece called Open Data and Algorithmic Regulation. And in it, I made the point that, you know, regulation has become a bugaboo. You know, everybody goes, oh, you know, regulation. But that's because regulation is interpreted as a set of rules. But in fact, we live with all kinds of regulatory systems that we love. You know, just try, you know, driving a car without the regulatory system of your carburetor, you know, or your fuel injection system. You know, think about, you know, the regulatory system that we call the autopilot that, you know, flies us around. You know, I learned really interesting. I was on a flight recently where I was talking with a pilot, and he was like, we in a busy airspace like San Francisco, we can't actually fly manually in and out of the airport because it's, the tolerances are too tight. You got to do it on autopilot. I mean, crazy. You think, oh well, don't you do at least the takeoffs and landings on autopilot? No, actually, that's sometimes the place where they most use the autopilot now. Crazy, but the point is, here's a regulatory system. It works. We accepted it because it works. Credit card fraud detection, right? We're being monitored, and we accept it because it's protecting us. Anti-spam, a regulatory system.
Yeah.
Google search quality, a regulatory system. So what do all these regulatory systems have in common? They actually have a clear objective, kind of what I was talking about earlier, that everybody's agreed on. It can be imposed unilaterally. I mean, Google says, here's our regulatory system. We want to have the best search results. We want people to click on the top result and go away happy, right? And at least that's the theory of it, And Uber has a regulatory system. They say we want people to be able to pick it up in 3 minutes, right? The question is, so are there other factors that we could take into account?
Right.
And my sense is that if we could get, first of all, the clear, statement of here are the outcomes that we're going for. Then you start measuring, are we achieving those outcomes? And I love Google search quality as a model. Because it's something they've written a lot about and you talk about. But things like just wonderful signal, like short clicks and long clicks. This idea that if somebody clicks and goes away and doesn't come back, that's a long click. If they click on a result and they come right back and then click on the next one, that's a short click. A short click means they weren't happy with the result, so it gets demoted. So they built this wonderful feedback loop, and that kind of feedback loop dynamic, which we've really mastered in Silicon Valley. It's all over. So it's what drives Google, what drives Facebook, what drives any of these modern apps, where we have the data that's feeding back to making the service get better and better as people use it, is so largely absent from the way that government does regulation. So what I would love to see is, I'd love to see a partnership between cities and the services they want to regulate, where there is real shared data, shared visibility, clear objectives. So the city, for example, says, okay. Oh, and by the way, credit card fraud detection is another really good model of a regulatory system in which government actually doesn't micromanage. It simply said, hey, guess what, guys? You only get to charge the consumer for $50 of bad debt. And all of a sudden, it becomes the credit card companies' duty to regulate. Right. And so the question I have, and I don't know what the right answers are, but like if you were thinking about how would I regulate Airbnb, how would I regulate Uber and Lyft, how would I regulate any of these companies, I would be asking myself, what are those interventions that will squarely put the shoe on their foot? And like a good example of this like if cities wanted to come down on the side of labor, they would say, okay, we're not going to tell you how much you can charge, but we're going to tell you that you can't go below this amount. This came to me one day reading an article about Uber's rates in Detroit. And Travis does a lot of hand waving about the perpetual ride and how great it is. And they go, well, at one point they were offering drivers 30 cents a mile in Detroit. And just a simple thought experiment to me said, okay, well, let's assume that with the perpetual ride, I get, 30 cents a mile. Maybe I'm going 30 miles an hour. That's $9 an hour before expenses. I go, your city could say, no, your rates have got to, add up for the perpetual ride at the very least, or whatever, for some, percentage utilization, to this amount. You go, and sorry, you can't go lower than that. There are ways, we're so stuck in, we have ideas like minimum wage, and we go, well, we don't know how to apply these in a world where, it's on demand and people work for multiple people. You go, sure you can. You could go, yeah, we're gonna say, we want to know what your typical utilization rate is. We want to know what your per mileage rate is. and at that utilization rate and that mileage rate and whatever else fees, this is what it is. You could do some back of the napkin math and come up with some rules, right? Yeah. And then you go, okay, and we're going to periodically audit those rules. And if you're not paying enough, you're going to have to pay the drivers. I mean, there's a bunch of ways that these guys could intervene much more creatively than, oh, you can't pick up in New York City if you're from New Jersey. That's just stupid.
Yeah, that's right. So really what we're talking about is the difference between pushing these square pegs into these round old holes from the old system, or getting creative and really thinking about how to...
Yeah, what are we really trying to accomplish? Yeah. And also really trying to get to a meeting of minds. I do think that, there are, real challenges. I mean, one of the things that I think, again, really muddies the water is the lack of financial literacy on the part of so many people, where they confuse market value with profit and loss, for example. How many times have you seen, Uber is worth, $60 billion, they're so rich. You don't know what their actual profitability is. They're losing billions of dollars a month in some markets. So the question is, what's the actual profit and loss there? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of interesting, to kind of, how would we kind of back off a little bit? Because sort of the notion of, well, Uber's sort of screwing its drivers because they're worth so much. That's a totally different system of money. Right. Right. It has nothing to do with whether they're succeeding as a business. Right. At some point, if the stock market stops, giving them money, they could be out of business. If we don't know that though. Yeah. And so again, I feel like, it's sort of harder right now in a world where so many of these companies are private so late. Yep. Yep. When companies are public, that's why, again, go back to sort of Walmart as an example, where it becomes very, very clear that Walmart is shoving costs off onto society, right. And capturing it for its shareholders. Yeah. When in fact, would Walmart, they might be less valuable, but do we really, would somebody say, oh, I wouldn't want to own Walmart if they were, if they were only making $15 billion a year instead of 20? Yeah. I mean, that's silly. I mean, if you think just, what it would do is it would depress the stock price, and who does that actually affect? I mean, you go, well, of course it's the, all the shareholders, and you go, well, how much of that is sort of pension funds, and those are ordinary people? Well, it turns out a lot of the pension funds, they're making all their money on. I mean, they're making all their money churning stuff anyway. Yeah, it's like if they were in Vanguard or some other index fund, they'd be doing a lot better for people, and they wouldn't have to be pushing so hard for, we need to have the stocks keep going up and outperform. Right.
Well, so just to finish this thing on the government though, because as we're winding down here, you spend a lot of time with people in government. You ran these whole Government 2.0 conferences. Mm-hmm. When you look at the next couple of years here around city government, state governments, even federal government, I mean, do you see some kind of potential big shifts happening in terms of regulation or kind of categorization of workers, or are we in a window here of kind of fluid window that some stuff could coalesce pretty quickly, or are we kind of in the early days of experimenting? It could be
I think
5 years more.
Government and quickly are terms that don't usually go together. But which is a shame, because government can play such an enormous role. And I do think that while it's very easy and popular to rag on government. Mm-hmm. It does an enormous amount of good in our society. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Even the most staunchly libertarian who think government should be out of everything, they're quite happy to use the roads. They're quite happy to, have regulated airwaves. Mm-hmm. I think that we have an education system. You can go to a country without government, and it doesn't look very good. And I like to say government is us. It's a mechanism for collective action. And so the question is, how do we make it more responsive? How do we make it more effective? And that's a lot of what we work on at Code for America. It's like, okay, you have policies. Do they work?
Mm-hmm.
How do you make them work?
Mm-hmm.
And what we all saw on display with the failure of healthcare.gov was that you can have the best policy in the world, and if you can't implement it, it doesn't do you any good.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that the government couldn't actually build a website, even though they threw $1 billion at it, is criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we really have to do is we have to get better at government. We don't need less government. We just need more effective government.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look actually the share the taxes as a share of GDP is pretty constant over decades. I mean, this notion that government has been growing is wrong. But what is the case is that government collects way more money than it should and doesn't do as much with it as it could. Mm-hmm. If you look at one of the things the private sector is good at is getting really good at being efficient with things, because there's creative destruction, whereas government doesn't really have that. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be a discipline of government getting better at what it does. Mm-hmm. And technology has taught some amazing lessons about how to build services at scale that get better as people use them. And I think we need to take some of those lessons from technology about how you instrument services, how you measure, how you constantly improve, and take those into government. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, what we're doing at Code for America.
But again, potentially...
And other groups like United States Digital Service.
But do you feel... So I see what you're saying. I totally get the long term on that. But I'm just thinking, it feels out there, and some people we've been talking to in this series have been talking about there's a couple-year window where bad regulation, bad categorization of workers as this or that. A lot of stuff could go wrong in the next few years that would set this back. On the other hand, if we did it right, it could actually propel the positive things forward. Is that your feeling?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it ranges from, movements like portable benefits, which are a different approach to the safety net. I was just talking with a guy from the UK who was also talking about how do we build better marketplaces for connecting people to work that's effectively occasional work. Apparently they've built a system in the UK, and the U.S. has this great workforce training system, and they spend a huge amount of money on, but it's really only for, quote, jobs. And again, that sort of pivot that we need is from jobs to work. What work needs doing. Again, that's one of those crucial next economy pivots that I see. How do we stop talking about jobs, start talking about work? How do we stop talking about getting rid of people, start talking about how to augment people? How do we start talking about the legitimate aims of public policy rather than just sort of having people do these things which are really not in the interests of society as a whole? And how do we have a robust discussion about what those goals ought to be? And I think there's a certain role for that kind of antagonism. We have a society that values sort of the butting of heads to get to truth, and whether it's through the legal system or whether it's through just public policy, lobbying, and so on. But we also, I think, we could do a lot better at creative engagement, and I think there's some really wonderful opportunities. We think about Airbnb, great. What kind of city do we want to build? And what makes it a good place to live? What can we learn? And there should be massive amounts of data sharing. Nobody should be writing rules yet. They should be, they should be writing the smallest possible rule set while they figure out what's going on, and be focusing on, well, what's really happening and how does it relate to what we wish was happening, but think about drones, and all that's, possible there. You think about, self-driving cars. I mean, you think about, just employment and the nature of employment. All of these things are going through these massive technological transformations. And if we have regulations that are only backward looking, that try to make things look like they used to look, that don't actually sort of say, let's take a fresh look at what we're trying to accomplish as a society, we're really missing a huge opportunity.
And so I guess my last question, or about the last question here, you said you're an optimist in the beginning there. How optimistic are you that this will play out with a backdrop here of the conventions and polarization in the country and all the different things we know here? But are you optimistic that this is going to move ahead? Or tell us, how optimistic are you, or how pessimistic are you where we are?
There was a wonderful piece in the Atlantic recently called "In Praise of Short-Term Thinking," and what it was like you can believe in the long term, but you still have to worry about disruption in the short term, and and that we have to be proactive at looking for that disruption. So I guess I would say I'm incredibly optimistic about the long term. Just as going back to what I said earlier, those people in Ned Ludd's rebellion couldn't imagine what the descendants of those machines would do for our society in making us all so much richer than even the richest aristocrats of their day. And we should be thinking the same way about our future. Oh my God, these new technologies, what will they make possible? What could we do if we took all this technology and said, wow, let's go reinvent everything? Instead of just saying, well, we're just going to optimize to, I mean, it's kind of keep going back to Uber. Like they had this brilliant insight on how they could use technology to do this thing that was previously impossible. They built this great company, and then they start talking about, no, well, now we're just going to get rid of the drivers. Why aren't they talking about their flu shot, experiment? Like going, well, in 2014, we gave flu shots on demand, where we delivered a nurse. Like with self-driving cars, think about all the other things that could be on demand. Yeah, sure, the drivers won't be there anymore, but there'll be all kinds of other new kinds of services that could be on demand. What an amazing future. Let's get up freaking optimistic about all those things that are possible. Zipline in Rwanda, they're going, there's no roads, there's no hospitals, but guess what? We can use drones to deliver blood on demand to women who are dying. Postpartum hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of death. We can get blood there, anywhere in the country. Bang! Drop it with a parachute from a drone. It's like, holy shit. We can get medications out. That's like, let's rethink the world using today's technology. And so that fundamental optimism of how much possibility there is. What will AIs help us to do? What kinds of creative worlds will we see in virtual reality? Just like we're in the age of Hollywood. What's that going to look like when we're able to make these world-spanning visions? And oh my gosh, there's so much ahead of us, and we just have to kind of, I think, so that fundamental optimism about this is amazing. Let's get there. And let's stop optimizing for the short term. Let's start optimizing for the long term. Let's think about how to make the society that we want. Let's harness technology to do the impossible. And I think, I guess I would just sort of say, one of the things, that history teaches us is that government plays an enormous role in that process. And our current distaste for and distrust of government is part of the problem. We have to get rid of that. We have to actually understand how to make government work again. Because when government works, it really becomes a governor for society. It helps, moderate the excesses. It helps, deal with market failure both on the upside and on the downside. And we're going to need everything we've got. We're going to need government. We're going to need technology. We're going to need everybody on this planet to pull together to solve some of the challenges we've got in the years ahead.
Perfect place to end on an optimistic note. And I loved your theme of reinvention, which is something that obviously here at Reinvent we're totally into. So a fantastic interview, really laid it out from the big picture to the granular, and I didn't expect anything less from Tim O'Reilly, and I really appreciate you coming here.
All right, thank you. All right, this is fun.